This is Butrint. I will pause for some childish laughter. Hey, if you think that sounds borderline rude, just wait till you see its name in Latin. It's a curious and deeply beautiful place. We're about as far south as you can get in Albania. The Greek border is just a few kilometres away, and Corfu is visible at the mouth of the channel that feeds into Lake Sarmil. Like many amphibious sites, the exact watery conditions that brought it about would become its undoing. Butrint was a settlement that was founded by a Hellenic people called the Chaonians, and would hugely thrive and develop during its Roman years, and particularly in the 500s to 600s, where it became the seat of a bishopric, and this left behind these vast churches. Butrint would be fortified and re-fortified as it was later fought over between the Byzantine sphere of influence and Latin forces from the west. We don't know the exact sequence of its depopulation, but Butrint as a territory became linked to Corfu, and by the time the Venetians gained possession of the island, the once great city faded into insignificance. You can see the manner in which the low-lying former Roman properties flood, and while the Venetians built a fortress across the water and a tower on the opposite side of the channel, the settlement must have been an eerie sight. The crumbling walls of a once busy forum invaded by trees, once great edifices inundated with fetid water. Yet we think some limited occupation had continued on the higher central point of the island, so people would have been constantly stepping over the ghosts of the past. While the rest of what is now Albania would become the domain of the Ottomans, Butrint is an outlier. It would, with some difficulty, be retained by the Venetians, but mainly as a source of fish, some olives, and some timber. But as an ancient place to visit, it really is incredible. And if you've been following the narrative, we've actually been twice now. Once all the way back in 2019 on our first ever glimpse of Albania, and now fast forward 5 years, we had made up a lot of the distance north to south, starting from Dubrovnik airport, heading through Montenegro into Albania, then crossing pretty much the whole length of the country north to south, ending up in Gjirokaster, pretty close to the southern border. Now, Gjirokaster is really gorgeous. I got a bit of a better look at it at sunrise before the rest of the boys were up. A supercut? Yeah, I think we should have a supercut. Anyway, I'd asked everyone if we could get going promptly, as some of the things we were going to be seeing on this day got busy quickly. So, we were on the road, and title card. So we are Forest Archaic Collective, and as well as making jungle drum and bass, we've followed ancient sites across Europe and beyond, whether it's Neolithic standing stones, Roman arches, or Romanesque churches. We are proudly and fiercely AI-free, and we've always believed that if we're going to share these stories about ancient places, we need to go and film them for ourselves, not just spam a stock library, definitely not get the data centers to slop out some half-plausible looking garbage. Actually go and see these things for ourselves to show you. So please support us in doing that. More on that at the end of the video and in the description. Oh, and we did it again. There's such tight deadlines to get these done. I keep finishing episodes and uploading them before realizing I haven't put out the results from the previous game. So catch those at the end. So we were enjoying the mountains rolling past, and firstly to nip into these Roman ruins, really in the middle of basically nowhere, though thankfully just enough of a road to get there, though goodness knows I wouldn't have wanted to do this in anything other than the sort of 4x4-ish car that we were in. Yeah, we're kind of fortunate the hire car place had bumped us up. So a theatre and other structures of Hadrianopolis with the beautiful framing of the mountains, just lush. Hadrianopolis, unsurprisingly, named after the Emperor Hadrian, and I had a feeling like, I feel like the disambiguous page for that is going to be, oof. Yeah, no shortage of settlements named after him. In this case, the principal extant survivors are the theatre, can't miss that, but also these baths. And there's much more still under the soil. The settlement on the site goes back to at least the 400s BC. Then it was upwards to cross a mountain pass, though the road was decent enough not to warrant much concern, and we were heading to... Now, this has become a much more famous draw, having parked up and paying just €1 to get in, along with a fair-length walk past some astonishing scenery. This is the Blue Eye. It's a spring that rises up through the karst and just makes the most beautiful electric blue waters. I will say the focal point of all this, it's quite a small area, hence why it can feel like quite a crush when it's busy, so definitely worth getting there early in the morning. There were at least a couple of people flying here, but you really didn't need to. There's a viewing platform directly above it, which allows you to look straight down, making aerial shots kind of perfunctory. So yeah, glad we saw this when we did. It was just starting to get busy when we got there a little before 9, and on the return to the car park, it had already filled up. Just chance for a quick Freddo cappuccino. On the road again, stopped off here. This is the monastery of St. Nicola. I was unreasonably excited to see this. You can see its clear Byzantine architecture. This is from the 1200s, though built on the site of an ancient temple. Other than the church buildings and some ruined structures, there's the remains of a wall that ran around the perimeter. It's in a gorgeous location with the line of mountains that shield Gjirokaster County from the coast rising up behind. And then it was time for a revisit that I'd been looking forward to for a long time. This far south, we were at Saranda, and in particular, the archaeological park of Butrint. I felt like I'd shot quite a lot when I was there, but going back over the footage later, it felt like I barely had a glimpse. Well, first order of business, my biggest regret from last time, I wasted no time walking onto this little pontoon cable ferry thing that crosses the small gap. I was sat down, I felt something move at my trainer, looked down and the cable was just going past my feet. It's like, oh, okay, just keep away from that. But of course, what appears to be just a few planks nailed together that can unaccountably transport several cars at once did, of course, stay together long enough to reach the opposite side. And having only taken maybe 3 shots of it last time, I could now indulge in all the coverage I pleased of the Venetian castle, which I, of course, did, and it felt incredible. At one point in filming, I felt this insistent stinging behind my knee, and I realised that I had paused in the shade right on top of an ant's nest. Whoops. Had a bit of a nasty surprise that the entry to the main site was cash only. I had it in my head that being a UNESCO site and everything, it would have a card terminal. But, okay, no worries, there is an ATM down the road. Clearly, I was neither the first nor the last not to have cash on me. This was the ATM. I almost expected to see a saw puppet pop up on the screen, but with some trial and error, almost withdrawing £800 in Lek by accident, I eventually got some money out. If you didn't catch the last episode, needing cash was this perennial problem. You don't want to get out hundreds and hundreds of Lek. Actually, hundreds of Lek isn't that much. Okay, thousands then, only to be stuck with it on leaving. But the double gotcha, which really started to get enraging, ATMs were charging fees of £7 or more, that's in sterling, for cash, just to take cash out just once. And you sort of assume that maybe you've just been unlucky and found an opportunistic one run by a few bad apples. But the more ground we covered in Albania, this was just the norm anywhere you tried. And so vanishingly few businesses will have a card terminal or accept card as a payment. Anyway, that hurdle out the way, being back at Butrint was bliss. It was more busy this time. I was there in the afternoon, but then again, I think the same heat had scared away a lot of the morning tours by about 12, meaning it wasn't a complete crush. In fact, with some patients, I even managed to get some shots of the theatre, 90% clear of people, and the triconch, not a single person in frame. So enjoyed going over all of that. There's a wealth of things here, from the pre-Roman Hellenistic era through Roman, through Byzantine eras. By the way, if you're still in the process of typing your third angry paragraph because we've been using the word Byzantine, please save your keystrokes. The performative tantrum is perfunctory. Everyone already knows what you're going to say, and saying Eastern Roman Empire, particularly as you get into the early medieval, is unwieldy and misleading to a general audience. It's very useful to have a distinct term. It's not something to cry about. Right, so after Butrint, we headed back to Saranda, but first we did just make a quick stop. The last time we were here, we'd headed to the Ottoman castle of Lekareshi, which does offer some nice views, but is a bit boxy and modern. But on the hill opposite, this time I wanted to make a point of getting to the Monastery of 40 Saints. Now, while this was founded under Justinian in the 500s, this was doubly damaged by both bombs falling in World War II and demolition from the communists in the 1950s. But you can still see some of the surviving features above the rubble, and a bit of an aerial view affords you a better idea of the site. The piles of masonry did mean you had to step carefully, but a great site with incredible views. And with that, we're heading down into Saranda itself. It was really weirding me out that it was 5 years since we were here. Saranda seemed just as welcoming now as it did then. At the time, we weren't sure what to expect in Albania, kind of wondering if it was going to be a bit of a Wild West compared to Greece. And it turned out to be at least as welcoming and at ease as Greece, possibly even more chill in outlook. Parking proved, a bit of a fuss. Anyway, it was fine. So, sat down for some much-needed drinks on such a boiling day, got a better look at the ruined basilica/synagogue this time, even snagged a gyros on the way back. We had to head north. On our way out of Saranda, we ran into the thunderstorm that had been sort of squatting menacingly to our east. It's quite good timing, actually. The rain and winds were excoriating, but the hour drive north was a pleasant view, and soon we were overlooking Borsch. Now, it's everything you want, really. Beautiful, but also not over busy. Our time at Borsch was pretty idyllic. Unsurprisingly, we were pretty much straight into the sea. It's a really nice beach overall. We were staying in this apartment, which was exactly as nice as you'd hope, and just 100 yards from the sea. The sun went down on what had been a very full-on day, and we headed to one of the restaurants at the edge of the water. Again, while it wasn't life-changing food-wise, this was like £7, and for drinks and a great modern spot to spend an evening, could scarcely ask for more. So yeah, that was a really great night together. Taking a wander down the beach in the morning, I couldn't help once again think of Shenzhen. The contrast could scarcely be more stark. Borsch is largely underdeveloped, but there's just enough, the rough dirt track lined with a few apartments and a handful of well-put-together restaurants and bars, and a few camper vans. But most of all, balance. Few enough people to make coming here feel amazing, but enough facilities to also make it relaxing. It would be incredibly sad if the bulldozer and property speculator were given free rein to just concrete over all of this and turn it into a homogenous line of apartments end to end. I'm conscious that as these episodes are going out, there are protests taking place over the Trump family trying to insert an ugly resort at Sazan Island, a bit of a way up the coast from here. And I don't want to create the tragedy of the commons by compelling everyone, quick, get to this spot before it gets ruined, and in so doing, drive the engine of its destruction faster. I don't know. Planning laws don't appear to be much of a priority in Albania, or in fact, anywhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. I just hope this beach is protected enough to keep it special. Well, headed out of the apartment in good time, but just a short drive, and we were at Borsch Castle. You can see this on a prominent rise behind the beach, but you can only just see the smallest hints of masonry at the eastern edge. But when you actually get there and expend about a gallon of sweat walking up, you can see that there's a remarkable amount that's survived. The most prominent, the mosque above the main gate, this is not only impressively intact, but if you step inside, while battered and, suffering clear neglect, the fragments of the frescoes are still visible on the walls. The rest of the castle has a scattering of walls at various heights. Even at just after 9 a.m, the heat was intense, so retreated back to the aircon of the car. What followed was a quite remarkable drive, which is going to need its own supercut. Like other highways we'd used, the road north appears to have only been recently completed. Goodness knows what it would have been like attempting this route before a proper road was in, but as it was, a practically luxurious asphalt ribbon through just the most extraordinary landscape. Since Gjirokaster, I thought Albania had already showed off some of its best mountains, but this drive should be listed as an attraction. It really is special. Well, having made up some ground back towards the north, it put us just above Vlore, and we had a quick stop at Canine Castle. It's pretty impressive, though the transmission towers and modern additions here obviously not helping. Took a quick scamper around, though didn't stay too long. Nice espresso Vanti shot for the album. Back on the road, and before we actually sat down for lunch, we were at Apollonia. Unlike Bylis, which was barely signed from the road, Apollonia has huge full-colour signage beckoning you in, and with the sun beating down, we headed in. The monastery on the way in, which also houses the museum, was a really nice surprise, and the site boasts impressive ruins, the most famous of which probably being this reconstructed pediment of the temple. That said, it clearly needed a lot of help. It appears both these blocks and pillars are all non-original and not exactly sympathetic to the site, but don't take that as a criticism. There's, a small theatre there and many other structures to see. The city was founded by colonists from Corinth and possibly Corfu in Illyrian lands around 600 BC. And while there's a sizable coastal plain there now, this would have originally had access to the coast. It thrived for about 1,000 years and into the Roman period, but around the 400s, an earthquake changed the course of the river, causing the harbour there to silt up and more or less turn the area into a swamp, leading to the city's decline till there was only the monastery inhabited there. Kind of caught a fair amount, but then the sun pretty much drove us out. You might have noticed that all of our summaries of these ancient places are a little short. Here's the thing. While it's fun to do these travel episodes showing you what we've done, they're all building towards these much larger series. For example, we're talking about Hellenic, that's ancient Greek, if the term is not making sense to you. Well, we've been catching much more of this in the last 18 months, whether it's the huge and shockingly intact temples of Paestum, that's in Italy, by the way, just south of Naples, perhaps some of the best preserved anywhere. Bearing in mind, these are 2,500 years old. That was thrilling. We're going to have an episode on that trip pretty soon. Or finally getting out to the Dodecanese Islands, catching Kos and Rhodes. Kos has a huge amount just scattered in ruins around its main city. There's also this Asclepion just out of town. And more recently, we were on the island of Kea, catching some of the more ancient Bronze Age sites from around 4,000 years ago, as well as the Cape of Sunion and all the stuff that is there. And all of this is adding to the other things we've caught in Greece and further, whether it's ancient Athens, Sparta, Crete, the island of Evia, a place few people outside the country are even aware of. You can see our episode on that. Or Turkey, which has an incredible wealth of Hellenic sites, Cyprus to Sicily, and even as far afield as Marseille, where the Hellenic port of Massalia can still be seen. Like I said, it's a huge amount, and we've not exactly been idle in the UK either. I was looking ahead, and while I've been holding these back for what seems like forever, we're going to have to start gearing up for our episodes on ruined abbeys. These are some of the most incredible and evocative places in the British Isles, and there's a huge number of them, yet they rarely seem to get talked about, something I cannot for the life of me understand. So, there is a huge amount to come, but this entire year we've been pretty stuck. With a couple of outliers, our attempts to get this out to a wider audience have mostly been falling flat. There are Roblox channels that hoover up more views in 20 minutes than we've had all year. And to be clear, this is not really a function of human behavior. It's the complete blind lottery of this week, YouTube feels like putting our stuff in people's feeds. Oh, and this week, just no. Despite the content being materially the same, some weeks the platform likes you, and just as inexplicably, other weeks suddenly you're dead to them. And the 5,000 odd people who've shown some interest in our stuff are never even given the chance to see it. Yeah, so much as it's irksome to have to ask, you're going to need to put on the notification bell to really be in with a chance to keep pace with everything we're putting out. Otherwise, we just get buried alive. The 20 plus hours it takes for every episode on a rolling 7-day basis just basically down the drain. It's maddeningly unfair, but this is just where we're at. We've got to compete with the history slop channels, poisoning the well with straight up hallucinated misinformation. So yes, please help us out and we can get actual history out to a wider audience. And now, rather overdue for lunch and a break, we drove to the outskirts of Thea. It does still crack me up. There's a region called Thea County. And basically, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing nearby or really any special view or anything, there was just this really nice modern restaurant called Ignatia. This would normally feel way too fancy for the likes of us, but here we all paid about a tenner, including drinks, and the food was incredible. So that was brilliant. Back on the road, and while the A2 is a really good road, the landscape couldn't compare with the mountain dreamscapes of the morning. So only about an hour north, and with some mildly tedious threading in amongst the busy roads, we finally got a stop in Durres. Now, I think it's pronounced kind of like that, like Durres rather than Durres. At least that's what I heard at the time. I don't know how many drafts this trip went through, but in some of the early versions when I thought I might only be able to sneak in 24, maybe 36 hours of Albania onto some other trips around Montenegro and elsewhere, I'd always tried to get Durres in there. It has this huge Roman amphitheatre, which is one of the largest and most significant Roman sites in Albania. Despite its seating being in less than immaculate condition, Durres was a significant port and fortified centre from antiquity and through the medieval years. It saw major conflict during the Norman-Byzantine Wars, and while it's not the most celebrated part of the city, some of its medieval walls can still be seen. But as with many ancient cities that now have modern cities atop them, there's a funny contradiction here. Durres is Albania's second largest city, and while the old town remains very differently laid out to the stretch of the modern city, just look at the difference on satellite view, the archaeology is very much having to fight for space. And while the amphitheatre may have been saved from the encroachment of modern structures, the surviving walls just to the north are only just visible between all the houses. At the southernmost point of the walls, this tower is described as the Venetian Tower. Woo, yeah. But it's a Venetian augmentation of the already existing Byzantine defences. I caught some additional smaller sections of Roman archaeology. The sky had clouded over, and while we'd considered a swim, it looked like this would not be the part of town to do that. So with a quick iced coffee to shelter from a shower, and then we were on our way. After almost all of our Albania experience so far had been the mountains, the coasts, and the ancient ruins in the mountains overlooking the coasts, it was strange to be in the much more urban surroundings. The highway from Durres to Tirana is only about 30 kilometres between the two outskirts, but the entire length is pretty commercial and visually busy. It's a corridor of businesses and billboards pretty much the entire way. Tirana was much more intense to drive. I was definitely grateful not to be the one behind the wheel, but eventually, after a couple of rather frustrating loops, we managed to find somewhere to park a walkable distance from the centre. So, new hostel, this definitely going for the boutique side of things. It was nice. We were all pretty hungry, but wanted to eat non-expensively. I think we went to a bar and got burgers. I didn't actually film them. They were fine. Not magical, but fine. Well, I reckon folks got a good night's sleep. I headed out into Tirana, early but not incredibly early. I headed for the castle of Tirana, but this is somewhat minimal, or at least the parts you can access. It has a foundation date from around the 500s under Justinian, but what you're mostly seeing here are Ottoman walls that appear to have mostly just been turned into shops and restaurants now. There are some lower walls that have been uncovered. I've not been able to find a confirmation if these are from the earliest fortifications. You can certainly see a marked difference in the masonry. Not loads left to see here either way. Walked a bit further. Being a capital city, there's a lot more ground you have to cover on foot. Here's the thing, and it's no surprise, capital cities are always a bit different to the rest of the country. They form a sort of natural magnet for wealth and progress, and Tirana is no different. And I opened last episode with this observation of people's outdated perspectives on what Albania is like. While the ancient history here was more than enough to pique my interest, I'd also learned a lot from a channel called Rare Earth. It's run by Evan Hadfield. It's sort of a gourmet version of what this channel does if, I spoke to the camera on location and also had a budget. Anyway, highly recommend you go and watch the Albania episodes. It's just a great channel in general. Now, this was released in October 2018. I'm assuming it was filmed shortly before. And he mentions the bunkers being ubiquitous across the country. And, they kind of are. We definitely didn't find ourselves tripping over them everywhere. More just, there's one. And, likewise, I can't lie, I'd always been rubbing my hands like, okay, Tirana, let's see some communist stuff. Come on. But the city shows little sign of it now. In the centre, there's not much evidence of your standard commie blocks. Everything looks rather nice and certainly in more of an international style. The streets were pretty clean, lots of trees. There was some litter sometimes, like in this river, but in general, everything felt very modern and well-kept, more so than, let's take Sofia in Bulgaria, for example, which retains a lot more of its communist look and feel. I headed to the museum, but, for a moment, I wasn't sure if I wasn't approaching it right. Like, is there a side entrance? But no. When we went, it was having some major overhaul and was not open. So, that was annoying. There was quite a lot I was hoping to catch from around the country that was now completely off limits. Well, okay. I caught the Skanderbeg statue. Went back and got the boys. We had coffee from a really good spot just down the road from the hostel. As is often the case in capital cities, there seemed to be no shortage of great coffee spots to pick from. And okay, not a lot of communist-y stuff around, a few monuments that stood more as like art installations in this park. But okay, I know one place we can get a really good brutalist monument. Hey, that looks a lot cleaner than I remember. Yep. Once again, the Pyramid of Tirana, which looked every bit like the rundown leisure centre when I'd last seen it, has, since the Rare Earth episode about 6 years previous, this has now received a paint job and a makeover. I'm sure before, almost every kid in the city at some point would have run up and down its graffiti-covered slopes. Well, now there's stairs, so you can just fulfill that impulse anytime you like. Yeah, look, it's no shock that Albania would want to shed its, let's be honest, not very flattering image of the communist pariah state of Europe it may have been in the 1980s. It's just surprising how rapidly and successfully they've done that. And look, don't get the wrong impression, I am thrilled for them. Would have liked to have seen a bit more communist-y stuff, but it's nice to see a country doing well. I mean, yeah, okay, this is just architecture. And yes, of course, you can find some less pristine neighbourhoods. I'm sure native Albanians could tell you about how under the surface there's plenty that's not going right and the various difficulties. Yes, everywhere has those. But viewed in a span of decades, the trend is very much upwards. So it was time for us to get out of town and head east. But that is going to have to be a story for next time, as we're once again crossing borders, this time into North Macedonia, to spend some time around the quite incredible Lake Ohrid. This really was a high point of the trip, so catch that next time. However, before we wrap up, we had another round of aerial GeoGuessr 2 episodes ago, and last episode I once again forgot to include the results. Apologies all round. So first, it was Colchester. You can just see Mersey Island there. That was kind of our clue when we saw it. We've been talking to the guys at Colchester Museum. We're hoping to do some episodes with them, so keep an eye out for those. Next, and I had my suspicions, even though we were super high up still, I recognised this is Bradwell. It was the site of a Roman fort, which is now nigh on impossible to perceive just by looking, whether you're high up or right there on the ground. But from the ruins of that fort, the chapel of St. Peter on the Wall is one of the most ancient and significant Saxon survivors in the country. Very well done, Mercian Moonrise, for also catching that. Then we were flying west and I spotted this. This is the hill fort enclosure at Whittenham Clumps, so now over Oxfordshire. And finally, this is Cirencester, the Roman civitas, particularly known for its amphitheatre, but also a really great museum. So I would like to do more of this, but we'll leave it for a week where we have more time. Otherwise, if you've enjoyed the music in the background, it's ours. We make all the music for these episodes and you can catch it on bandcamp.com. If you want to support the channel and flick us a couple of quid, that's the place to do it. Also, you may have gathered, we're kind of working to a backlog. This was almost 2 years ago now in the summer of 2024. But to see on what we're doing on much more of a week-by-week basis, follow us on Blue Sky. You can see a lot more of where we're going there. And yes, please hit the notification bell and subscribe. And we'll catch you very soon.